So, just to get started, Bertalan, you were talking about this, are we all standing? Yeah. Okay. You were talking about this pilot's metaphor, and to extend the metaphor a little bit, it occurred to me that the reason doctors are the pilots of the airplane that is health is because doctors, like pilots, are trained. And although we've all seen the disaster movies, the fact is most of us in the cockpit would have no idea what to do. There's too many buttons. However, you're right that with simple interfaces, with the right information, we can at least take a little bit more control. I know when a plane is delayed or when it's bumpy, it's nice to know what's going on. That's very reassuring. But all of that reminded me of a very short passage in Victoria's book that I'm going to read out that I think will be a very useful way to frame this argument for the next 20 or 30 minutes. Victoria talks about Huntington's disease. It is an incurable brain disease. It's inherited, which means that if one parent has it, you have a 50% chance of getting it. And it sounds absolutely dreadful. Reading now, it destroys the brain in a characteristic way. First, the areas of judgment, then those of perception, loss of strength and vigor. It also destroys the part of the brain that modulates movement. So the movements of patients with Huntington's disease are jerky, dancing movements. Now, for the longest time, so Huntington's manifests itself only in middle age, which means that you don't know if you have it. You get married, you have children, or you don't get married, you have children. And you discover only after your kids have grown up a little bit that you have this terrible disease. You have very likely passed it on to your children. Then, and I'm reading again, a predictive blood test was discovered. So you could find out in your 20s or 30s whether you're likely to have Huntington's or not. You could make decisions about your life and those of your unborn children accordingly. So one way to know, of course, writes Victoria, one wants to know, of course, that one is free of a heritable, dementing, and incurable disease, but one wants to not know that one has it. So taking that test is a kind of test of moral strength. And so that is the way I'd like to open this, and this is a question for both of you. Yes, we now have access to a lot of information, but do we know what to do with it, and are we equipped to deal with it?
I think that belongs to Bertalan, since he's
You use my metaphor with the pilots. Well, thank you. I said that the patient should not be the pilot. I said that the patient and the physician should be in the same cockpit, driving that plane. So far, it hasn't been the case. So what I try to evangelize here is not that patients should start diagnosing themselves online with a few Google searches, and because I have this gadget measuring 5 parameters, I know everything about my health. No, what I'm saying is that now we have access to that, so I need to be an expert of my own body. And since 1997, I have been quantifying my health, my emotional, my physical, and my mental health. So when I go to my own GP, I have a GP, of course, then he likes me. I'm not his favorite patient, but he likes me. The reason why is that I save him time, I save him effort, I have very focused questions. The therapy we agree upon, or the therapy he prescribes to me, I will comply with that because I understand the reasons why it's needed for me. I'm an empowered patient for him. So he will love working with me. And that's the point here. To put physicians and patients in the same cockpit, the only change we do is that we ask patients to step their game up, to know more about themselves, not just wait for a decision from above to someone solve their health problems. Nobody will solve your health problems without your activity, even though many patients expect that from modern medicine. Plus, regarding the physician's perspective, it's very easy to burn out. It's very easy to not be able to keep up with the huge amount of medical information, to focus on the personality of the patient when you have to deal with bad technologies. You type in information through an old keyboard. That's what you deal with. If you want to keep yourself up to date, there are 23 million medical studies on PubMed.com. If you only read one per day, that's at least 1 hour. In your lifetime, you won't go through the 5% of your own sub-medical field of interest. So with technologies, we can help physicians focus on the patient, what they're the best at dealing with the patient, but patients need to step their game up and have health management.
Victoria?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you're point about Huntington's disease is one thing, but I think in general what I'd like to say is that you can see that we're very different people here, I think. So when Bertalan goes to his doctor, he wants to be a partner, he wants to understand, he wants to know. And frankly, I don't want him. I don't want to know anything about my health. It makes me nervous. I want to be happy, I want to live, I want to be healthy. Now I'm talking as a patient, not as a doctor. And I don't want to know anything as long as I feel great. And then the day I get sick, I just want the doctor to be a really good doctor and fix it. I don't want to know anything about it. So I think we have actually two different personality types here, for starters. And I expect the audience will fall into one or the other. So I just don't want to know. I don't want to do any of those things he talked about. I wake up in the morning, I feel good or bad. Usually I feel good. I'm happy about that. I have a cup of coffee. I don't know want to know what's in the cup of coffee. It's either good or it's bad. I like it or I don't like it. If I don't like it, I don't drink it. If I like it, I drink it. You know, I like to read books where I can, you know, write things down and turn pages. I'm very skeptical as a person. So the 23 million, is that what you said? 23 million publications. I happen to know there's only about 3 of them that are worth anything. And those 3 of them surface pretty quickly. I don't need the other 22,999,997 of them. So I skip that. So this is a very different personality type. And I'm happy to have a patient like you as a doctor. So that's my first point. The second point is that most of what Bertalan talked, in fact, the word he used quite a bit was the word health. Taking care of your health, maintaining your health, and I think it's all very fine, really, if you're into that. What we haven't talked about here is sick. And what I see as a doc is what happens when people are sick, and it is a completely different space than being healthy. Even Eric Topol, who's the maverick of this, whose book on creative destruction of medicine is all about what you were just talking about. The patient's going to be in charge, and it's going to be a wonderful utopia out there. Even he, in the book, at some point, he's carrying around everything that Bertalan was doing. He had his own ultrasound, he was doing it all. Then he gets sick. And the first thing he does, and he writes about it in the book, he's shocked. He calls up the best doctor he knows and talks to him on the phone and has that doctor actually examine him. He then doesn't talk about that moment again in the book, but I thought that was very telling. So I think that all of this is fine as long as we're talking about being healthy. But once you're sick, you need to have a doctor who is trained, who has the kind of experience that this is not going to give doctors. And I think the thing that most worries me isn't a patient or a person who does all this work on themselves, follows all their electronic stuff, but what happens to the education of doctors when we no longer really understand the body from the inside? Because what happened for me in my training was that after medical school, that was all fine. I learned a lot of pieces of information. Then I did a 3-year residency in San Francisco in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. And it was fascinating because by the end of the residency, I had a deep understanding of how the body worked. And it doesn't work logically. It works there's so many ways in which things influence other things and people are individual that you have to be able to get a sense of this for the person. And when we put doctors in the position of being computer geeks and computer nerds and going on the computer for all this, I don't see how they're going to get the experience. So I think in a way we're talking about almost a lost art. It's like paint by numbers and an artist. And how do we end up with artists if we have paint by numbers?
Victor, Bertalan has a rebuttal, after which I have a question for you.
Great 2 points. Let's talk about the sick. I'm lucky to be able to talk about improving my health because I'm not sick yet. I will be at some point in my life. But if you take a look at those influencers who are empowered patients, but they are sick, they have diabetes, they have different cancer types, you will find them on social networks such as Inspire, Smart Patients. There are bloggers who have millions of followers, like Carrie Morone from sixanatomy.com. She's one of the, I think, the best diabetes blogger in the world. She told me and my medical student, because I use her materials to teach my medical students about empowered patients, she told us that she has an amazing doctor. They have a great relationship for decades. But when her doctor tells her that she understands her problems, she says it's not possible unless she has diabetes too, and she doesn't. So she needs the social interaction with diabetic patients around the world to get the personal piece of advice and suggestions every day. So when I talk about health and using technology for improving health, that's step number 0. The real issue comes when we have to deal with the patients who have diabetic conditions or any kind of medical conditions. And they want to use technologies even more because they won't get those personal pieces of advice from their physicians because their physician, luckily, doesn't have that specific condition. They can know a lot of things. They can be experts about the treatment of that condition, but they will not understand many of the issues they have to deal with every single day. Because even if you have a chronic condition, in 1 year's time, you will spend days at the hospital or with a physician at a doctor-patient visit, but the rest is self-care. You will be at home. You will have to talk to someone who understands your problems. You cannot call your physician several hours a day just to get answers for simple questions. And they turn to their own communities, and they won't find those in the neighborhood. They will find those on social media through any kind of digital channels. That's one.
If I can interrupt for a second. Victoria, you were talking about reassurance, which is what you get from a doctor, a human being, a real relationship. And Bertalan points out that doctors are not available. You said to us earlier before we came on stage that there simply are not enough doctors. There need to be more doctors in the world. And the solution is to train more doctors. Until we do that, is it not possible for people to find reassurance from data, from computers, from other people who have the same ailments? And then,
yes,
sorry, Bertalan, we'll come back to
I would say yes and no. I mean, I think that what Bertalan, it's really interesting, and this is a very good use for, because part of my approach is to start to understand what is technology good for, and what is it not good for? And what is it not good for because it's just not very good technology, and what is it not good for because it just doesn't work no matter how good it is? That, I think those three things. So where does this fall? So what I've noticed is that for what Bertalan was just talking about, which I don't think of as being sick, I think of as having a disease, having a chronic disease, you're with it, right? You're trying to treat your diabetes. This is a chronic disease. It's very useful to have these, the Facebook groups. You can learn a lot from people's experience. I use it myself just to get an idea of what people figure out very interesting treatments for some of their chronic diseases, tricks to use. This is an excellent thing to do. Being sick, being actually sick, you can't function this way. And I make a distinction. So when the diabetic has an infection and their diabetes is completely out of control and they're septic, they need to have a doctor. And they need to have a doctor who understands deeply what the different possibilities are. It's not a question. I don't need to go to a computer and find out what are the causes of sepsis in a diabetic. I need to know that.
I think we're veering dangerously close to all agreeing, so I'm going to move this along.
Let's fit it out.
Bertalan, very quickly, in 1 minute.
Exactly, because it seems like I think there's no need for physicians. There is a bigger need for them than any time before. Although I want to reflect on your point about the art of medicine. Today, physicians have no chance to improve the art of medicine. They have to type in information. They have to fill out forms. They have no time for the patient because they have 80 patients, some of them just coming for a prescription, to refill a prescription, when all of this could be done digitally just like this. So what I'm saying is, with these technologies, the doctor-patient relationship will have more time, will have more focus on each other, and physicians can focus on the patient. Now they don't focus on the patient, just in the minority of their time. They focus on the gadgets and technologies around them, electronic medical records, and just inputting information. With better technologies, we remove that part, and that time can be spent and kept on the patient. That's why I think that the technological evolution can bring this chance to us finally. That's why we are about to agree regarding the major point
I'll disagree.
here.
Okay. I have a disagreement.
Just 30 seconds, Victoria, then we'll move along.
I have a disagreement. So the question is, what's the diagnosis and what's the treatment? Okay, that's the way I look at it.
Right.
So what's the diagnosis? Is it that doctors don't have enough time with patients? Is it that there are not enough doctors? Or some combination of this? So I would say they're either both, right? There are not enough doctors, or there's too many patients, or the ratio's wrong. Well, what's the solution? So Bertalan is saying the solution is to have technology in some magical way take over these things, clean it up so that doctors suddenly have time back with the patients. Well, first of all, if you look at what's happened, technology has not done that. Technology has done the opposite. If we could trace out a little graph right here, what we would see is technology goes up, doctor time with patients goes down. Now, Bertalan is saying if technology goes up even farther, all of a sudden, magically, this curve is going to change. Well, I don't think so. So that's the first thing. There's no evidence. Wait a second. There's no evidence. You want to get into it, we'll get into it. There's no evidence base to show that more technology gives doctors more time. There is evidence to show that more technology gives doctors less time. Electronic health records is a perfect example. That's number one. Number two, technology, the burden of technology, the disaster of electronic health records is driving doctors out of medicine. 40,000 doctors a year in the United States are retiring. I know, all my friends are leaving medicine when we can. None of us should be leaving medicine. We're the docs you want. We're old, we're experienced, we know what we're doing. And none of us can stand what's going on. We could have the equivalent of 8 years of medical school doctors back in our system in the United States if we created a system that allowed doctors to do a good job. And the system we're creating is not that system.
2 points to
that?
reflect on that. First, well, you are saying that we could train more doctors to meet this demand from patients. I'm saying that by the time you train that many doctors, we will have much better technologies in our hands. You're saying that with the technological evolution, it has started deteriorating the job of physicians. I need to give you one correction. That's the evolution of bad technologies. That has been around, and we are impatient. In decades, we had more medical technological explosion than in hundreds of years before. And we are impatient now. If a new smartwatch comes out that can do the same as the Apollo spaceships back then, it's nothing. It's just one announcement of the many technological news. If we are a bit more patient than that, IBM Watson, for example, can bring you more medical knowledge than any invention in the history of medicine.
No, he can bring us more medical data. Data is not knowledge, and knowledge is not wisdom.
It's semantic. If you ever had a chance to talk with IBM Watson, it has natural language processing. I know I'm afraid of some of these technologies, but to have a chance to talk with that, it feels like a natural conversation. If you ever have a chat with a chatbot, which almost has artificial intelligence, you will be scared and surprised how effective they can be. So again, bad technologies bring us there.
Yes.
Physicians need to focus on the technological part, not the patient, but the good ones, which will only come out if there is a demand from society for better and better ones. So then companies will develop better and better ones, and the demand will be even bigger, building a pyramid. On the top of the pyramid, we have physicians having time to focus on the patient, scattered around with good technologies that save time. Which is one more thing. There are no studies. There are no studies for the fact that technology can save time for the physician. Although I can send you studies, evidence-based ones, showing that or concluding that empowered patients, on the other hand, can save the time and energy from the physicians and effort. They have more specified questions. They have better compliance with their physician. There are great studies for that. So technology will not change anything, but empowered patients will. And empowered patients need data, and they will use technologies as a second step. But the first emphasis is not on technologies, but on the empowerment of patients.
Right, Victor, I'm not going to let you respond. I'm going to check, because we're running short on time, if anybody in the audience has any questions. And I can't actually see. So, all right, there's a question back there, if someone can get a mic, please. And there's one down here. So let's start with this one right here next to you.
Me?
You, yeah, okay. Both of you. And then that guy over there, and then we'll have to come to closing.
Hi, I'm Agnes. I study at the Central European University, and I'm going to be graduating hopefully in 2 weeks. And I'm writing my thesis on patient empowerment, so this was really a perfect opportunity to hear you guys speak. So in my thesis and in my research, what I've noticed is that there has been a discursive shift, sort of, in patient empowerment, and patients have started to turn away from institutionalized medicine because simply they're not empowered. They don't have access to their data. They're not presented with their healthcare opportunities or alternatives. They are not consulted with. And there has been this sort of turning away, and what Professor was saying, people have started to reach towards these digital communities, like Patients Like Me or 23andMe and Ben's Friends, and they've started to find this supportive community there rather than going to their doctors. And I think institutionalism is on this verge of having or being pressured to react to this. And I was wondering, I was wondering what your opinions on this are. How is institutionalized medicine going to react to this slip of the patient?
Is this for Bertalan or for both?
Both, please.
Who would like?
Well, I think I'll take it first because the United States is in a little bit different situation because they've been responding, actually. Partly because it's a profit-based healthcare system, and the administrators believe that the more they can do what patients want, apparently, the better off they are. So most of the electronic health record systems, to their credit, allow patients in the United States to get into the system, to see their own data, to correspond with their docs that way. Whether, in fact, that creates what patients want hasn't been studied, and that would be a perfect place for you to do your postdoc.
Absolutely. You make excellent points. The gap between institutions and empowerment is becoming really huge. And no one seems to be taking anything or caring about that. So what I try to do is I try to shock those people at institutions to understand that if they don't make some steps forward, patients will. And we don't want to let this happen, because if patients' empowerment takes place without the interaction with physicians and the medical systems, that's going to cause a chaos. So we need both, but the gap between them is huge. And as patients are much more motivated to do anything towards patient empowerment, and institutions are not really motivated regarding this direction, they will of course do that without the interaction with physicians. So we have to empower patients, but if we don't persuade institutions to step their game up as well, that's going to be a chaos for sure.
Right, could you pass the mic along, please? Really quick question, I'm afraid, because we're running out of time.
Very, very quick question. So, very interesting about doctors and patients, but what about companies, right? So, those who make actually these wearables, if that's going to be the future, really, really cool. But what about the contracts? Because right now, it's really, really lazy. I don't really know if my data is actually secured. What's going to happen?
A very good question.
But lazy question. I struggle with it every day, to be honest with you. When I choose a wearable, I get a wearable from them, whether the data is HIPAA compliant is very important in the US, whether they have approval from the FDA or CE approval, anything like that, I need to be a doctor, a researcher, and a geek to be able to find solutions for these problems. People will not have this lucky position by using wearables. So we could do two things. First is, which should be the most important one. We would need authorities, policymakers, decision makers, who are the most knowledgeable people about these gadgets right now. Based on my experience, I travel around the world giving speeches. Policymakers have never been further away from this kind of knowledge than today. So it's almost a mission impossible. The second is, by acquiring digital literacy, we would be able to make our own decisions. So when I, for example, just one short story, when I try to choose one wearable to measure one of my health parameters because I have a health problem, I want to solve it, I try to find out the company behind that, contact address, whatever approvals they have, the feedback and reviews on the application stores. I ask my social media contacts, just like in real life when you want to buy something. So I know it's a struggle. With good authorities, with approval gadgets, or badges, we could make this simpler for people, but this wearable revolution has been going on for about 2 or 3 years. We are not even the baby steps. So with a bit more patience, in the coming years, we might get to that point.
But then this sounds like a lot of work to have access to your information too. And I suspect not everybody has quite as much social capital as you do online, has the same connections that you do. And you also advocate to us that we should wholeheartedly embrace this adoption of data and monitoring ourselves, while admitting that policy does not exist. Policymakers will, in future tense, have to figure out what to do, and at the moment it is mission impossible. I find this a very strange mix where on the one hand you think we should jump headlong into it, and on the other, it's entirely unregulated, and this is the most sensitive information that we can disclose to anyone.
Exactly. Without the demand from society, there is no chance that authorities will make steps forward or companies will develop better devices. So we can expect that without our activities, without creating a market for that, companies will get better by time. The FDA will understand what they have to
in the
put
meanwhile,
on the
we're just guinea
policy on
pigs,
table.
sort of handing over our data and hoping that, and this is America, where data standards are, I mean, most of these companies are American, and US data standards are much, much more lax, as I'm sure you know, than European data standards. Right now, there is a case going on in the European Court of Justice to discuss whether Europeans' data can be sent to the United States under the Safe Harbor Agreement, or whether that agreement is no longer fit for purpose. And that is stuff like mobile phone data. We're not even talking about health.
That's thin ice, I give you that. Although I won't give up my freedom of accessing data on my own risk, because I want to wait decades
Right.
for a company or an authority to make some decisions.
So
I want to demand that
So the
from
key
them.
point is at your own risk, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, we had one hand up over there. All right, you're here. Excellent, thank you.
The biggest point.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Peter Varga, and I've studied program engineering mathematics. I'm interested in AI, and I'm also a business coach and a trainer. So I'm also have some psychological knowledge. And what
Very
I
quickly,
heard.
your question, because we are almost out of time.
Yeah. The point of your discussion or your disagreement was on emotions of the patient and how they react to the emotional challenge when they are shocked by being sick, really sick. I would like to hear your thoughts on how you think the best way is to deal with these emotions from your perspective.
Thank you. Victoria?
I think you want to have friends and family around you. It's about human relationship. There's no amount of data or information that's going to soothe you when you feel like you're dying or might die or facing a terminal illness or you're in pain or you're freaked out. So it's it's the personal. And if you're lucky enough to have a doctor or a nurse who's also experienced and knowledgeable, that's really helpful. But certainly your family and friends, kind of a cocoon around you, I think is the most helpful.
There's the feeling of never being alone. If you have a chance to make this happen in real life with your friends and relatives, you're lucky. But if there's no chance for that, there's still help outside in the world. There will be people dealing with the same problems. I give you that. That's 100% certain. And you can find those people with the long tail effect on social media or any digital solutions.
Thank you. Okay, good. We have 2 minutes. I'm going to ask you both to talk for 1 minute each with your closing statements, and I'm going to ask you a question with which to frame your closing statements. Start with you, Bertalan. You advocate technology as a means to alleviate crises in healthcare globally, and yet, at the start of your presentation, it took us a while to get the presentation going. Now, that's fairly non-critical, and nobody died. But why should we trust this stuff with much, much more important things?
Oh, I get it so many times. Papers burn down. Technology goes out. It happens. What matters is if it becomes better and better, just like how paper became better and better before, it's going to be amazing. I don't want to sound like an overly optimistic person, but seeing those changes in medical technology over the last few years, not even decades, that I have seen, the time that is coming towards us can be extraordinary. It's not going to be like that because technology can bring this new chance to us. It's going to be extraordinary if we will be prepared by the time it hits us. And without that, that's going to be, again, humanless service. If we are prepared, that's going to be a science fiction in our lives.
Victoria, for you, you talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. The ugly was Google Glass. Google Glass is something Google itself has given up on for the time being. Yeah. It did not work. And since we're talking about profit-seeking companies with profit incentives, we can talk about the market, and the market did not accept the product. So is it not also the case that technologies, when they are simply not good, will not survive?
It's a great question because I happen to know for a fact that although Google Glass gave up on Google Glass, that story I told you happened after Google Glass gave up on Google Glass. It's a for-profit company that got this hospital to equip all their docs. This was just a few months ago. So here's a perfect example of that not happening. It's a private company that's hyping up this idea that you can save time and have more doctor time when your doctor walks in with this. They literally, that's how they hype it. It's like your doctor walks in with a little computer, looking at the computer and not at you, and that is somehow going to create a better doctor-patient relationship. That's the fact of the matter is. So I would say that what I am a skeptic, and I also think some of the things that Bertalan showed are superb. I mean, my gosh, the 3D printer stuff is fantastic. It's just wonderful. This idea that you can turn your phone into all these different scopes is marvelous. But at least I come from Silicon Valley, and I can tell you the hype there is overwhelming, and it's not obvious. That's the problem. So I'm going to, Eric Topol, who's like the maven of this, he does not mention, and you have to go searching, that this man who's talking about the virtual utopia, medical utopias out there, he has options, millions and millions of dollars options in all these private software companies that he doesn't talk about. So there's a lot there. We need to be really clear about that piece. That's the piece I'm most worried about.
Right, thanks, Victoria. I'm going to wrap up, and I'm afraid I'm going to sound incredibly trite.
I hate when that happens.
But it sounds to me at the end of this hour and a half of discussion that there is reason to be optimistic, but you also necessarily need to be skeptical or at least critical while being optimistic. Is that something we can all agree on? And I know I said we shouldn't agree on anything, but we're ending now.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Skepticism. Yes.
Thank you both. Wonderful chat.
That was great.
Thank you, everyone.